Hello, I'm Hazem Seeker. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week,
Senator, we run ads.
How to get ahead in digital advertising in 2018, why the new ad men dislike regulation, but like harvesting as much data as possible about you. Also this week, France's labor pains. Will President Emmanuel Macron be derailed in his attempt to shake up the world's fifth largest economy? Plus, international tensions send the price of oil to 3-year highs, and the ruble has its worst week in 20 years. Well, the world of online advertising is changing fast, and it's all because of the explosion of technologies which help companies make money from processing our personal data. And what we found out this week is that there is a lack of transparency, trust, and even insight into how this world operates. Let's say you want to place an ad on Facebook. The social network puts out lots of information on how to buy ads on its platforms. Companies can, and I am quoting here from Facebook, choose their audience based on demographics, location, interests, and behavior. They can feed ads to a bunch of other apps and mobile websites through the Facebook audience network. And all of it is completely unregulated. Facebook has been correcting its own homework, so to speak, for some time. The result, a data leak affecting 87 million of its users and a grilling for Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg by US lawmakers. Alan Fisher has more.
Ditching his favourite grey T-shirts for a suit, this was a polished Facebook CEO with a performance to match. Mark Zuckerberg apologised for the massive data breach that impacted 87 million users worldwide.
We didn't take a broad enough view of our responsibility, and that was a big mistake. And it was my mistake, and I'm sorry.
But the importance of this appearance was not lost on one senator.
This should be a wake-up call for the tech community. We want to hear more, without delay, about what Facebook and other companies plan to do to take greater responsibility for what happens on their platforms.
The core issue was summed up with one question from Democrat Dick Durbin.
Mr. Zuckerberg, would you be comfortable sharing with us the name of the hotel you stayed in last night?
No.
Mark Zuckerberg was called in front of the Senate after it was discovered millions of users' data was improperly obtained by a UK-based political consultancy, Cambridge Analytica. They used that information to target ads to help Donald Trump's presidential campaign and the Brexit referendum in the UK. The Facebook founder says steps will be taken to ensure such a data breach can never happen again. But one senator asked if he was ready to follow through on that promise.
I believe you have all the talent. My question is whether you have all the will to help us solve this problem.
Yes, Senator.
Do you believe the European regulations should be applied here in the U.S.?
Regardless of whether we implement the exact same regulation, I would guess that it would be somewhat different because we have somewhat different sensibilities.
Well, a big takeaway for most followers of this story is that the US Congress seemed to know very little about how the biggest social network on the planet makes money.
So, how do you sustain a business model in which users don't pay for your service?
Senator, we run ads.
I see.
Would you agree that users should be able to access all of their information?
Senator, we have already a download your information tool that allows people to see and to take out all of the information that they've put into Facebook or that Facebook knows about them. So yes, I agree with that. We already have that.
Have you ever drawn the line on selling data to an advertiser?
It's actually one of the most important parts of how Facebook works is we do not sell data. Advertisers do not get access to people's individual data.
Now, according to Group M data, by the end of 2017, Google and Facebook had an 84% share of global digital media. That's excluding China. Traditional media and ad agencies just can't compete. Basically, a duopoly has formed in the world's advertising industry. Yet Google and Facebook share none of the responsibility of traditional media and insist on being called technology companies. That's despite making more from ads than every newspaper, magazine, and radio network in the world combined. And it's all because of targeted ads using our data. Artificial intelligence in the shape of algorithms is also upending previous advertising models. But even industry insiders admit they don't exactly know how it all works. Now, this lack of transparency means advertising can end up next to inappropriate or illegal content. Earlier this year, major advertisers pulled spending from Google's YouTube for exactly this reason. And there's questions, too, about whether companies are being billed correctly. But the only way to find out is by asking Google and Facebook. So let's talk more about the way digital marketing feeds on consumer data. Joining us from London is Federica Caltona, a data program lead at Privacy International. Thanks for being with us. So just talk to us a little bit more about how this works. I mean, how effective are these targeted ads?
I think it's important to take a step back and remember why we're talking about this current scandal. So the hearing in both the Senate and the Congress were supposed to be about data privacy. It ended up being about lots of different issues, content on platforms, but ultimately it is about the way that companies use personal data. And as it stands, most people do not understand and cannot possibly understand the way in which companies exploit their data for advertisement. So here's an example. Facebook loves to talk about the data that you share on Facebook, but prefers to talk less about the data you share with them.
And why is that, do you think? Because it does seem that this industry there's a lot about it, as you say, that is not known. It's very opaque right now. What should be done to address that?
I think the most sensible thing to do, or that is needed, is the data ecosystem in many countries around the world is heavily under-regulated, and the current scandal shows how utterly urgent deregulation is needed. Facebook likes, or companies like Facebook, love to talk about content. They love to talk about the data that you share, because this puts the onus on the consumer. Privacy setting means that it is your responsibility to control what data people can access. But in reality, companies track you around the web. Companies track you across devices. They use this data to profile you and then target advertisement. So there's the misconception that Facebook shares data, but it allows advertisers instead to target you on very precise criteria. And this is exactly what has happened here.
And
what is needed is sensible regulation.
How effective are advertisers in doing this very kind of precise targeting?
Sure. I think, as a rule of thumb, the more you know about someone, the better you are at persuading them. A perfect example is to say, if you know that somebody is interested in, say, a particular kind of medicine, you know how to reach these people. I think on an individual level, it certainly means if you know my deepest interests, if you know where I've been, if you know the other things I have liked, this is quite effective in targeting people. It doesn't mean that that my entire worldview will be changed by seeing an advertisement, but it is the invasiveness is about finding very specific audiences, and in a political context, that becomes very problematic.
But is there a sense that perhaps this is the future in the way advertisers get to their audiences?
Facebook likes to present it, and this was evident in the hearing, that what we're seeing is a fair deal between consumers and a company. The platform is free, and in return people share data. But that is not the case. The New York Times just published a really good article that outlined how the advertisement practices on Facebook have changed over time. And what has happened is that the targeting has become ever more precise and ever more invasive. And I think it's one thing to declare that you're interested in something and receive an ad. It's something entirely different if you're being tracked around everything you do, if the company then uses these data to make fine-grained profiles on you and then target advertisement. It's not just about advertisement. I think Facebook has 2 billion users around the world, many people in very vulnerable situations, refugees, people who struggle with addiction, for example. So the platform has a responsibility to protect these people.
But you
can still make money with advertisement without targeting them at that fine-grained level.
How would you do that then?
You can just simply target people less precisely. And this is what Facebook has done in its early years. Over the years, it has gone from targeting people based on the information that they have shared, based on information from tracking them around the web. This is not inevitable. Those were company decisions that the company has made. And one change that has happened last week, many people do not know that Facebook has used data from external data brokers to target people. In the UK, and I tested this myself, one example was financial information from a data broker called Experian. Facebook now stop this relationship, but it just shows, I don't think, how much more invasive that is. Many consumers do not expect to be targeted based on financial information if they have not shared that information with the company itself.
But doesn't this precise targeting allow companies to make more money? I mean, isn't that the reason why they're doing it? Isn't that what it's all about?
It certainly allows Facebook to make more money. It's one of the most valuable companies in the world. And the question we have to ask ourselves as a society and as people around the world is what price are we willing to pay? It's not about not making money off advertisement. The question is who pays the externalities? And I think what we've seen now, targeted advertisement seems harmless, but it has created an ecosystem that's very complex that can be hijacked by all sorts of people. One example is political advertising. Facebook is tackling that issue, but there are many more problems that the platform struggles to address. Scammers that target vulnerable people who are then buying a fake medicine. That was an issue that was brought up in the meeting in Congress. Those are one of the many issues that are a result of this very invasive tracking.
Frederica Caltona, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
We saw some big shifts in the energy, currency and metals markets this week as tensions ratcheted up over Syria. Brent crude briefly rose above $73 a barrel on Wednesday, its highest level for nearly 4 years. That's after US President Donald Trump warned Russia to get ready for US missiles to be fired at Syria. At one point, the Russian ruble dropped over 10% against the US dollar. Moves, too, by the US to slap sanctions on Russian businessmen and their companies started to bite in the metals market. Now, the sanctions bar US entities from doing business with the named individuals and companies. This includes Oleg Deripaska and his aluminium company, Rusal. Aluminium posted the biggest 5-day gain since 2009 on fears of supply disruptions. Rusal is the largest producer of aluminium outside China. Now, the ongoing trade spat between the US and China may be cooling off, at least for now. US President Donald Trump even welcomed a promise by China to open up its economy further. That's despite China filing a complaint with the World Trade Organization challenging President Trump's tariff hikes. Our China correspondent Adrian Brown has more from Shanghai.
Shanghai's dramatic skyline is a symbol of the economic reforms that began in China 40 years ago. But President Xi Jinping chose another part of the country to announce a deepening of those reforms. The setting for his speech was the Bao'ao Forum on the island of Hainan, a key diplomatic event and so the perfect setting for an important policy announcement. An announcement that sought to soothe foreign investors now worried about a trade war between China and the United States.
This year, we will significantly lower the import tariffs for vehicles and also reduce tariffs for some other products. We will work hard to import more products that are competitive and are needed by our people.
Xi wouldn't say how big the cuts would be or when they would happen, but reducing such tariffs are one of President Trump's main demands. And the Chinese leader may have had Trump in mind when he warned against a Cold War mentality and protectionist policies that disadvantage China.
We hope that the developed countries will stop imposing limits on normal and reasonable trade of high-tech products and lift the export control of high-tech products to China.
Cue the applause from an audience that included world leaders appreciating perhaps the irony that China's Communist Party now sees itself as a pillar for free trade. The president's speech was big on promises but vague on detail, but his words seemed to be conciliatory and there appeared to be a message to the United States and others concerned about Chinese trade practices. President Xi promised to protect intellectual property rights, another major area of concern in Washington, a further attempt to present China as a responsible, rules-abiding member of the global trading system.
And Japan has welcomed a decision by the US to explore the possibility of rejoining the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership. Donald Trump has asked advisors to see if a better deal could be negotiated. The president previously called the deal a disaster. It would be a major policy reversal for the US president, who withdrew from the pact soon after taking office, citing concerns about jobs. The TPP includes 11 other Pacific Rim countries. Well, still to come on Counting the Cost, the first bond deals from Saudi Arabia and Qatar since the blockade. Plus, beekeeping and battling Afghanistan's vast opium poppy growing industry. Our French President Emmanuel Macron has been defending his economic policies. He's facing a big test as the first anniversary of his election nears. Reform of the railways. He tried to reassure voters on national TV on Thursday. He chose a schoolroom setting in the northwest of France to deliver his message.
Et je vais être très clair avec vous ce midi. Oui, allez au bout.
I'm going to be very clear with you today. Yes, I'm going to see through to the end, because we need to do this reform. It is essential. There is a collective hypocrisy for not doing it. Deep down, I'd be lying if I said that in an ever-changing world, where mobility is evolving, the SNCF of tomorrow will not be that of yesterday. The future SNCF won't work if I say to the 25-year-olds we hire today that they'll be hired on the same terms as my grandfather.
Well, joining us now from Paris is Jacques Relland, a senior research fellow at the Washington, D.C.-based Global Policy Institute. Thanks very much for being with us. So, President Macron's government says the public sector reforms, these reforms are needed to slash costs and improve efficiency. But he is taking on some very powerful and entrenched interests here in the unions. Can he succeed where others have tried and failed?
Yes, I mean, at the moment he's taking on the most militant unions, i.e. those of the railway workers, who have a great power of nuisance. His reform is going to be inflexible. These reforms, and he made the case for these reforms that they were good for workers, they will be good for users, and he also promises new capital and insisted on the fact that this reform of the railway system in France would keep it in public hands, because many of the demonstrators have been saying that it was an attempt at privatizing French railways, which would be anathema to many people. So he's reassured them.
Is this a fertile environment for reforms to be made? I mean, is this, does he have a chance to succeed here in making the reforms?
I think he has a chance. Already he's got one big reform under his belt, is the reform of the labor market, which took place before Christmas, and that was very good. And this one, that went down quite well and was voted, and with little protest, because unions and opposition parties were weak. This time union thinks that because there is discontent in the French population towards Emmanuel Macron, especially among the people who are at the bottom and in the middle of society, who think that Macron has done an economic policy which favors the rich, because both the tax cuts that is implemented are more beneficial to the rich, and he claims that it's for the good of the economy, and the economy is doing very well actually, but many people do not feel it in their pockets.
There have been some comparisons made, though, between President Macron and the former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and the reforms that she had made in Britain in the 1980s in trying to reform the public sector. Do you think that comparison is fair, do you think? Because she was a very divisive figure.
No, I don't think it's fair at all. It's caricatural, because Margaret Thatcher hated the state and public ownership, and she did everything to dismantle public ownership, and she also tried to destroy unions. That's not the case for Emmanuel Macron. Emmanuel Macron wants to transform society. Yes, he's a liberal politician, which in France is not quite common. People don't like to accept it. He wants to reform France, but he still believes that the state has a strong part to play, and he still believes, from what he says, and I think nothing goes to prove the contrary, that the French welfare system is good and must be preserved. It must be reformed, but he doesn't want to completely dismantle or completely change it.
You mentioned there his approval ratings earlier. If the French public continue to feel the pain of these strikes, the disruption of the rail services and all the rest of it, the longer this goes on, does President Macron, his political capital, whatever he has left, and his ability to push through these reforms is going to be affected?
At the moment, the big battle, you're right to point out, it's the issue of public opinion. In the battle for the railway transformation, the railway reform, we have to see in which way the opinion moves. Will the opinion backs the railway strikers as they did in 1995, where the railway strikers struck by proxy against an austerity policy that had been implemented by Chirac and Juppé without being announced. But Emmanuel Macron is saying that all the reforms that he is doing, he's mentioned them in his program, in his campaign, and that they are for the good of the country. And I think we can see public opinion at the moment doesn't think that railway workers are justified to go on strike. He has to explain more because up to now he's been seen as firm, but he has to show some empathy, and he has to also develop more the storytelling about his reform, and he started doing it. Up to now it's more his minister who spoke. For the first time in a long time now, he's spoken directly to the people. We'll see what the impact of these interviews will be.
To the Middle East now, where Qatar and Saudi Arabia were active in the bond market this week. Saudi Arabia issued $11 billion of debt earlier in the week. It is the first capital raising by both countries since Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain and Egypt imposed a blockade on Qatar, closing their land, air and sea borders. But Qatar raised $12 billion in its first dollar bond sale in 2 years, and that's the biggest dollar bond from an emerging market nation so far this year. The International Monetary Fund said last month that the financial impact of the blockade is now fading. And finally, opium poppy cultivation in Afghanistan surged 63% last year, according to the Brookings Institute. Battling the opium trade is a huge task, but one young Afghan student is trying just that through a honey business. Rob Matheson explains.
The business of bees is humming for 19-year-old student Frozan. In a northern Afghan village where few women work, Frozan's bees gather nectar from the flowers near her home. Frozan collects their honey and sells it, making her a rare local female entrepreneur.
At first, there were lots of issues because the village I live in is traditional and women are not allowed to work outside. But when I started beekeeping, I realized it's easy. Then I told the people about beekeeping and they accepted it and allowed me to do the job.
3 years ago, Frozan got a loan and bought 2 beehives. In her first season, she sold enough honey to pay back her loan and still make a profit. Now 12 of the blue boxes surround her family home. Last year, she made $1,450. That's more than double the average annual household income in Afghanistan.
When beekeeping arrived in our village, Frozan showed huge interest and I was happy. I supported her because it has been my dream to have a daughter who could find a job like this and make a future for herself.
The hives are part of a long-term project across Afghanistan, partly sponsored by aid agencies. Farmers who might have grown opium poppies are encouraged to keep bees and collect honey instead. Frozan's honey is sold in this shop in the nearby city of Mazar-e Sharif, and demand is said to be growing.
We want the government to stop importing poor quality foreign honey and instead improve our own Afghan honey.
Human Rights Watch says nearly 3 million Afghan girls still don't go to school, and only 37% of teenage girls can read and write. But Frozan says she's determined to create a more golden future for herself by studying economics and building her honey business slowly.
And that is our show for this week. Remember, you can get in touch with us by tweeting me at @HazemSeeker, and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or drop us an email, countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. And there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Hazem Seeker from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.